Buongiorno, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning to everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I will go back briefly to the themes that have been raised by Cristina in this first presentation. And I will say straight away that the development of our daily activities, the continuous development of our daily activities, such as learning, for instance, that we have just mentioned, finds in the environment a support, a very important element of support. Our behavior, in fact, is influenced by three main factors. One is our memory, all that we have learned during our lives, practically, and that we have also inherited through our evolutionary development, then the people surrounding us, and then the environment. So the architecture that sort of envelops our bodies. But we have also learned that too much digital surfing that we do more and more to the detriment of full immersion, as we were saying, reduces our imagination and our imaginative capacity. How did we see this? Even if architecture does preserve the potential of guiding us towards the use of our imaginative memory, just as the one that we've just mentioned. In fact, when we enter a given context, a given environment, in just a few milliseconds, we are able to develop some kind of feeling. How is it possible that in just a few milliseconds, once we enter within a space, we're able to develop this feeling, this perception? Well, when we enter a given environment, in just a very short period of time, we photograph the atmosphere of this place. And this atmosphere is the intertwining of many different threads. Many different threads that our sensorial system as a whole, which is very complex and goes well beyond just sight, as you can easily imagine. So our sensorial system is able to capture and integrate in just one moment. And this occurs because the perception of space produces a change within our body. It is for this reason that the brain, that is obviously integrated in our body, it is for this reason, therefore, that the brain, in just a few milliseconds, perceives and notices that this change has occurred. Now, all of these threads creating the atmosphere has been studied for a long time, thread by thread. And we know very well that natural light plays a very important role in the description and in the production of these feelings, just as we know that the dynamic, let's say, element of space acts very deeply. Studies have been made also on how the orientation, a clear orientation system, facilitates navigation and experience. And now what is very clear is that the internal or external presence of vegetable elements of plants within the context plays an important role. And also, we can also say that color plays an important element. The materials that are present in an environment, geometries, because a curved geometry or a rectangular geometry produces different aspects on the physiological system, the topology, sound, and also the smells that you have. Now, all of these threads, all of these elements integrate themselves and become a perception, to create this perception. So, a question. How how is it possible, if it is possible, how is it possible to intertwine, to integrate all of these elements composing space to produce atmospheres that can tune in with our expectations, with the expectations that we all develop day after day? Is it possible? The answer is obviously yes, it is possible. And this has come out very clearly in the past 30 years, especially with the development of neuroscience applied to architecture. This has led us to be able to identify a new modality in the relationship that our body has with the surrounding space. This is not unidirectional relationship. We're not like blotting paper that receives from the space a lot of different signals and then simply integrates them. No, our relationship is bidirectional. There's a constant loop between ourselves and the space we live in, the space we inhabit. So when we enter a space, a place, we immediately have a desire. We immediately develop an expectation, a basic sentiment, as we could call it, a basic feeling or sentiment that we keep inside and that we produce with the decision of entering this place and of developing a given activity in this place, such as, for instance, that of learning, just to stick to this example. So all of these expectations have their physiological DNA. So all of these sentiments, all of these feelings that we can have their own physiological DNA. What does this mean? That there is a different combination of chemical factors, of vital rhythms, and also of muscular activities. So what we can say, what we can imagine, what we can say at this point is that every individual feeling, be it one of relaxation, be it instability, be it fatigue, be it harmony, each one of these basic sentiments that we perceive is a different combination of all of these elements that compose the physiological mix. And this is a very important element. What then is very curious indeed, and is very interesting, is that these expectations, these basic feelings, are very personal in their nature, very extremely personal. But in reality, they also have a common universal, they have common universal roots. They are the outcome of the biological evolution of the human being. They're absolutely not, generated simply and merely by human experience. Furthermore, we can also recognize another important element, that all of these basic sentiments are then deeply connected to motor experiences. The motor sensorial system is cabled, let's say, is perfectly wired for the basic sentiments that we are talking about. Now, how can this be explained? Well, through a very simple fact, that from the Homo erectus to the Homo sapiens for about 2 million years, our ancestors that all come from sub-Saharan Africa, before starting off for the journey that for 2 million years they only communicated through gestures and body movements, because the larynx got to its current position, allowing us to vocalize only 180 million years ago, which means And this explains very clearly the reason for which our gestures, our movements, our body movements are so powerful, because they are deeply connected to, let's say, a significant emotional dimension of who we are. So what happens? And this is a very relevant element. In 1990, by chance, with serendipity, as is often the case in many different situations, in Parma, Giacomo Rizzolatti, an important neuroscientist, and his co-workers as well, they discover in 1990 that a monkey that they were working on to understand how the cortex was activated during action. So they discover that, yes, certainly the cortex is activated when they have to seize an object, they grasp an object, but also when they simply see the object taken by other people. So when they observe other people, for instance, grasping an object, the cortex is activated in any case. So they discover that within a given personal space or peripersonal space, objects talk to us. They're there, they tell us, and they convey a message. So they succeed in allowing for a simulation of the motor activity to be present within the cortex. So when we find, for instance, some objects in our space, around our space, we see that basically what happens is that we perceive that these objects may activate motor simulation activities. So why is this important? Well, this space that envelops us all, it's not that we measure it in centimeters or in meters. As Enrico Poiré was saying, the father of topological geometry, he was saying we don't measure space in centimeters or in meters, but rather in potential actions. So in motor gestures, motor movements, our mind is predisposed, thanks to evolution, to constantly project movements within this space. So this is very, very important. We have a very special relationship with space, which is provided by our evolution, which has been determined by our evolution. But at this point, the ball ends up in the field of space, because space at this point may be available or not available to create the right conditions for this dialogue to occur between our projections and what we find outside. And James Gibson, in fact, called this availability or these features that the space architecture can take on to respond to our implicit projections, involuntary projections, which are part of a pre-reflective dimension that escapes our conscience completely. So James Gibson called these affordances. That is, so what he was saying is that in the shape of any object or element that exists in space, the conditions exist for there to be a meeting between people's expectations and the environment that should accept these expectations. It is for this reason that today we are capable of understanding that the architect can build environments which can really create and achieve this harmony, allowing for a correspondence between the multisensorial perception that we have of the space surrounding us and the shape of the place, allowing us in just a few milliseconds to perceive the feeling of being in the right place. So what we can say is that the threads, all of the threads that we have indicated and that create a whole, so topology, geometry, light, materials, so all of these threads, all of these elements can be put together and can be composed through a very consistent pattern, which is a pattern of action. And this aspect is very important because it is exactly here that biology and culture meet. In this dimension, biology, culture are not one against the other, but they develop a relationship of continuity. Just try and imagine how, like in this case too, the kinesthetic sentiment of lightness, which is connected obviously to that image of a person jumping, of that leap. So this sentiment is connected to the metaphor of the feather. And this has been expressed in culture, in artistic representation. And so it has taken on also its mythological dimension. All of these elements concur in building a bridge between the biological dimension and the visual and spatial dimension. So in this place, basically what happens is that the neuronal traces of motor gestures, feelings connected to these neuronal traces, and concepts all come together, all of the concepts that we have developed. Let's move one step further. Now, as a transformation in time and in space, bodily gestures can be interpreted in a very, let's say, detailed manner. So they can be read in line with a dynamic that characterizes body's movements in space and in time, scrupulously analyzing the different sensorial systems in the different phases that make up every individual movement. So it's these dynamics which translated in the 3D space can and allow us, through a multisensorial perception that we have of space by crossing it and by experiencing it, of recalling, first of all, the movements of the body and emotions also, which are connected to those body movements. And this, obviously, dates back to a long time ago. Now, going back to ourselves, so we ask ourselves, in our working places, in learning spaces in particular, can we use these patterns to produce results? Of course we can. We can do this. And this type of use is certainly finalized to produce an emotional engagement, which is very important and very relevant. And this also has the objective of producing a better interpersonal relationship quality, a better performance, better results, an increase in cognitive skills, such as attention and memory. One of the most emblematic cases that has been reported and has been used and developed is that of this is the headquarters of NG in Amsterdam. In 1978, they decided to have a new headquarters, practically, at the administrative heart of the bank. And they entrusted the project so as to develop it according to, with the idea of introducing also dynamic elements, a lot of natural light, a lot of plants, also therefore using part of that repertoire that we have focused on today. So they moved to these new headquarters, not only for these reasons, obviously, also because but experts also believe that this has been done also for these reasons. There was a reduction of absenteeism by 15%. The engagement produced by the new context had changed the levels of absenteeism in the company. Also in the schools, in the US, in California, in the Capistrano School District, a team of researchers developed a research study that compared tests carried out by some students under two different conditions. There were classes that were addressed that looked out on trees, and there was a lot of light, so optimal conditions, let's say in terms of the dynamics, in terms of perceptive dynamism. So one was this class. Another was a class of students that instead had the opposite conditions of very little light. They couldn't see the external world, they couldn't see the outside, or they couldn't see the trees also. The differences between the capacity of solving these tests by these two groups was completely different. I mean, we're talking about up to 26% difference in the outcomes. So it was a very, it was also much quicker. Students having the optimal conditions were much quicker at solving the problems contained in the tests. So just to summarize what we are saying, we can say that the presence of dynamic elements belonging to our biocultural history to create the correct and well-balanced cultural engagement through imagination that is triggered by consistent atmospheres produces more depth. You concentrate more on the present, that instead using a screen tends to weaken this. So the physical space in the digital era, by entering in communication with the body, plays a role which is even more central. The physical space in the digital era acquires an ever greater relevance, and this is because the digital era has aspects, as we've said, that must be tackled and must be managed. Then another element that should be underlined again is that we don't want to completely reverse everything that we've had up to now. It's not a matter of inventing architecture all over, but simply maybe rediscovering how over history men have always created adequate, atmospheres that were adequate and fitting with their needs, with their objectives. Today, we tend to believe that flexibility, neutrality of space is the central value that we need to create projects on. But this is not the case. We have understood that differently from this approach, it is instead the peculiarity, the distinctiveness of our experience in space that should be preserved and that we should provide an answer to. Because we must not produce neutral spaces and, let's say, spaces which are all the same. For instance, the experience of learning and of contemplation, characterized by a feeling of lightness, lightheartedness on the one hand, and amazement, awe on the other, even though they both have a dynamic propensity towards light, towards all that is high, they've always preserved a net distinction connected to the human scale in the energy of the thrust towards upwards, let's say. In the case of lightness, of lightheartedness, this has just been suggested. Instead, in awe, when we have awe, this thrust is very strong. You see on the left here, we have the Brudenklaus Chapel of Pietenzunker, where it is evident that going beyond the threshold, when you enter this, what is produced is a very, very strong thrust upwards, whilst instead here in this school, Lombardini, following the principles that have just been discussed, the passage towards the level of the classrooms, I mean, the thrust upwards is much more limited, as you can see. So basically what I want to say is the respect of design patterns which are connected to people's expectations may allow for the activation of engaging atmospheres. And space, so our second conscious, according to Alva Noe, by keeping us still in the hic and nunc, could help us imagine well in depth to feel inside what is happening in the present moment, for instance, by allowing a class of young readers, for instance, to even be able to seize the smell and the weight of the 4 animals that Renzo is taking to the Azzecca Garbugli. This is a reference to the betrothed. So thanks to this engagement that the architecture may create, even leading us to forget the presence of the smartphone. So in other terms, what I'm saying is that the beauty of architecture consists in the meeting between the experience of space and the deep expectations of the humankind. And it is here that what is distilled is, and what is produced is its ethical component.